She believed she was smarter than the police, the evidence, and the courtroom. What she didn't realize was that one small mistake would destroy everything.
You would acknowledge, ma'am, that Exhibit 193, that Mr. Alexander was stabbed. You would acknowledge that, right?
Yes.
She stood before the judge composed, shoulders squared, voice steady. This was not her first time being watched, evaluated, or judged. She had spent her life performing under pressure. This, she believed, was no different. A courtroom, like an arena, rewarded confidence. Her attorneys spoke carefully, framing her as responsible, respected, and remorseful. Letters filled the record. Credentials were read aloud. The narrative was clear. A good woman who made a single bad decision. For a moment, it seemed to work. But the court was not interested in who she had been. It was focused on what happened that night and what the evidence refused to forget.
Hand on the camera to shoot the picture accidentally or inadvertently, which is what everyone believes, that leaves her left hand free. Could she have had the knife in her hand at that moment? Now, the other theory out there from the defense...
From the outside, her life looked stable, structured, and respectable.
He was one of the funniest guys I know. He had one of the most infectious laughs.
She was someone parents trusted, someone neighbors recognized, someone whose name carried weight in her community. There was nothing about her public image that suggested recklessness or danger. In fact, everything about her suggested control. She had built her identity on discipline and achievement. Years of training had taught her how to perform under pressure, how to follow rules when it mattered, and how to present herself with confidence. Those traits didn't disappear when her competitive years ended. They simply shifted into a new role. She became a mentor, a guide, someone responsible for shaping young lives. Parents handed over their children, believing they were placing them in safe hands. Colleagues described her as dedicated and hardworking. Letters later submitted to the court painted a picture of a woman who showed up, who cared, who contributed. To many, she was proof that success and responsibility could coexist. At home, she was a mother of two. Her days were filled with routines familiar to millions of families, school schedules, practices, meals, and quiet evenings meant to hold everything together. On the surface, it was a life that felt relatable, even admirable. But beneath that structure, pressure had been building. Personal relationships were unraveling. A marriage was ending. Stress that once had an outlet through training and competition now had nowhere to go. What had always been managed through discipline slowly began to slip into coping. To the people around her, the shift was subtle. There were no public outbursts, no obvious warning signs. She continued to function, continued to work, continued to meet expectations. That ability to maintain appearances became part of the problem. Because when someone appears composed, trusted, and accomplished, it becomes easy to assume they are in control, easy to believe they would never put others at risk, easy to overlook the possibility that behind the image, something was quietly breaking. And that assumption, that the person everyone thought they knew was incapable of crossing a line, would soon collide with reality in a way no one expected. The day began like countless others. There was nothing about it that suggested it would end in flashing lights, police reports, or a courtroom. It was an ordinary evening, the kind shaped by routine rather than risk. Two children were buckled into the back seat, trusting the person in the driver's seat to get them home safely. What followed happened in seconds, but the consequences would stretch far beyond that night. A vehicle lost control on a quiet stretch of road. Parked cars were struck, metal twisted. The sound of impact cut through the calm. When everything stopped moving, the vehicle lay on its side in the roadway, its path marked by damage that told a clear story even before words were exchanged. First responders arrived to find a scene that could have been catastrophic. Children were still inside the overturned vehicle, shaken but alive. Against all odds, they had not suffered visible injuries. It was the kind of outcome officers later described as pure luck. The driver sat nearby, unable to explain how it had happened. Her account was fragmented. Details were missing. She said she didn't remember. To experienced officers, that uncertainty mattered. So did the smell of alcohol, the slowed reactions, the way the situation didn't quite add up. As they secured the scene, police began doing what they always do: documenting, observing, preserving. They weren't looking for a narrative, they were looking for facts. And facts have a way of revealing themselves when chaos settles. Inside the vehicle, small details stood out. Objects displaced by the rollover, items that didn't belong where they were found. Nothing dramatic, nothing obvious to an untrained eye, but enough to raise questions that couldn't be ignored. While the children were evaluated by medics and confirmed to be physically unharmed, the focus quietly shifted. This was no longer just a crash, it was an investigation. The day that started as routine had crossed a line. From that moment forward, every decision, every statement, and every piece of evidence would be measured against one unavoidable truth. None of this was ordinary anymore. By the time the scene was cleared, the tone had shifted. What began as concern had turned into quiet scrutiny. This was the moment when most people realize the situation is serious. But inside the interview room, she did not appear alarmed. She appeared composed. She answered questions calmly, without visible panic. Her posture was relaxed, her voice controlled. To her, this was a misunderstanding, an unfortunate accident that could be explained away. She believed cooperation and confidence would be enough. After all, she had spent years in environments where performance mattered. She knew how to speak when being evaluated. When officers asked what happened, her answers lacked clarity. She said she couldn't remember losing control of the vehicle. There was no medical explanation, no mechanical failure, just gaps. She acknowledged having consumed alcohol earlier in the day, but framed it as limited and unrelated. In her mind, this admission showed honesty, not liability. What she didn't realize was that interviews are not about persuasion. They are about consistency. And every missing detail, every vague response, every moment of selective memory was quietly noted. She declined roadside sobriety tests, choosing instead to wait, to watch, to let the situation settle. That decision wasn't confrontational, but it was strategic. She believed silence would protect her, that avoiding certain steps would keep the case manageable. Investigators saw it differently. They were not reacting emotionally, they were building a timeline, comparing statements to physical evidence, measuring behavior against probability. The confidence she displayed didn't register as credibility, it registered as control. And control in cases like this often signals calculation. As the interview continued, officers observed what wasn't being said just as carefully as what was. Her focus remained on leaving, on having someone else handle the aftermath. She spoke as if the most serious consequences were already behind her. But the interview room is not where cases are won or lost. It is where the foundation is set. Every word becomes part of the record. Every pause becomes a data point. And while she believed she was managing the situation, investigators had already moved past her explanations. They were following the evidence instead. She didn't know it yet, but the room she walked out of that night had already sealed her trajectory. While she focused on moving forward, investigators slowed everything down. This phase of the case didn't involve confrontation or dramatic revelations. It involved patience, paperwork, procedure, the kind of work that happens quietly, away from public view. Officers began by locking in the physical evidence. The damaged vehicle was documented in detail. Photographs captured positions, impacts, and items displaced during the rollover. Each image preserved the scene as it was found, freezing a moment that could no longer be changed. Attention turned to what had been recovered from inside the car. An object that seemed insignificant at first glance became important once it was logged, secured, and sent to analysis. It wasn't dramatic evidence. It didn't require interpretation. It simply needed confirmation. At the same time, officers reviewed body camera footage and written reports. They compared timelines. They noted behavior, responses, and inconsistencies. The lack of a clear explanation for the crash mattered. So did the admission of alcohol consumption earlier in the day. Each detail on its own was small. Together, they began to form a pattern. Medical records followed. A blood sample was collected according to protocol, witnessed, labeled, and sent to a certified laboratory. There was no rush, no assumptions, just procedure. Investigators knew the results would speak for themselves. This is the part of a case most people never see. There are no headlines, no public statements, just files growing thicker by the day. Evidence doesn't argue, it accumulates. When the laboratory results came back, they didn't require interpretation or spin. The number was clear. It confirmed what officers had already suspected and what the physical evidence supported. This was not a momentary lapse or borderline judgment. It was severe impairment. Prosecutors reviewed everything in sequence: the crash, the presence of children, the recovered items, the interview, and the toxicology report. They didn't need speculation. They had documentation. What she believed was a manageable incident had quietly transformed into a solid case, one built without pressure, without shortcuts, without noise. By the time formal charges were prepared, the outcome was no longer uncertain. The system hadn't rushed to judge her. It had simply done what it always does when evidence is allowed to speak uninterrupted. And the evidence was finished speaking. Up until this point, she still believed the situation could be managed. People like her didn't end up defined by a single incident. They explained, they apologized, they corrected course, and often that worked. But this case was never going to turn on character alone. It was going to turn on one detail she could not undo, reframe, or talk her way around. That detail wasn't her words, it wasn't her reputation, it wasn't even the crash itself. It was the evidence recovered from inside the vehicle. Investigators had confirmed what it contained, how it was used, and when it was last accessed. It told a story that contradicted the image she tried to project. This wasn't evidence of drinking earlier in the day and misjudging the drive home. It showed something far more deliberate. Active consumption, while driving, with children in the back seat. That single fact shifted everything. In court, context matters, intent matters, and this detail stripped away the possibility of a momentary lapse. It showed planning, concealment, and continuation. It explained the gaps in memory. It explained the loss of control. And it explained why this wasn't just an accident. It was a risk taken knowingly. Her legal team could argue stress. They could point to a clean record. They could highlight her compliance after the incident. But they could not erase that object from evidence, and they could not change what it proved. Prosecutors didn't need emotion to make their case. They didn't raise their voices. They simply returned again and again to that one detail. The quiet proof that she believed no one would notice. This is where confidence collapses. Because when a case hinges on something concrete, something documented and verified, explanations lose power. The courtroom stops listening to who you are and starts focusing on what you did. For the first time, it became clear that this wasn't about perception anymore. It wasn't about how she was seen by the community or remembered by colleagues. It was about a choice captured in evidence. And once that detail was placed on the record, there was no version of events left that could save her from what came next. By the time the case reached its final stages, the confidence she once carried had started to fracture. It wasn't sudden. It happened in small moments, hesitations, lowered eyes, pauses where certainty used to live. The version of herself she had carefully maintained no longer fit the reality of what the evidence showed. In court, she listened as her actions were described in measured, emotionless language. There were no accusations, no dramatic gestures, just facts laid out one by one. Each detail narrowed the space for denial. Each reminder made it harder to hold on to the belief that this could still be explained away. When she finally spoke, her tone had changed. The control was still there, but it was thinner now, stretched over visible strain. Her words focused on remorse, growth, and responsibility. She talked about lessons learned, about change, about the people she loved most. It was an appeal not to the facts, but to understanding. For the first time, her emotions broke through the performance. Tears surfaced, her voice wavered. The image of someone firmly in command gave way to someone reacting in real time to consequences she could no longer delay. This shift mattered, not because it erased what had happened, but because it revealed the moment she understood what was truly at stake. The courtroom was no longer a space she could navigate through confidence alone. It was a place where outcomes were decided by evidence already on the record. The judge listened, so did the prosecution, but neither interrupted the process. The system allowed her to speak, not to negotiate, but to be heard. Behind her, supporters watched quietly. Letters had already been read. Her history had already been considered. Everything that could be said in her favor had been entered into the record. What remained was silence, the kind that settles when arguments are finished and decisions are close. The mask she had worn since the night of the crash was no longer holding, and for the first time she appeared to understand that the ending of this story was no longer in her control. The courtroom was quiet when the moment finally arrived. This was no longer a place for explanations, apologies, or framing. Every argument had already been made. Every detail had already been weighed. What remained was judgment. She stood and listened as the court summarized the case, not with emotion, but with clarity. The facts were restated plainly: the level of impairment, the presence of children, the rollover crash, the evidence that showed continued drinking while driving. Each point reinforced the same conclusion. This was not a misunderstanding, it was a serious and preventable act. For someone who had spent much of her life directing outcomes through preparation and control, this was unfamiliar territory. There were no adjustments left to make, no words that could soften the record. The decision was no longer hers. As the sentence was announced, her posture changed. The composure she had relied on finally gave way to stillness. This was the moment she understood that reputation, achievement, and intent could not override documented reality. The system wasn't punishing who she was, it was responding to what she had done. The consequences were firm but measured. They reflected both the gravity of the risk she took and the narrow margin by which tragedy had been avoided. The court acknowledged the absence of prior offenses and the steps taken after the incident, but those considerations did not erase the core facts. When the hearing concluded, there was no dramatic reaction, no outburst, just the quiet weight of finality. This is how control is truly lost, not in chaos, but in procedure, not in accusation, but in resolution. The process moved forward exactly as designed, indifferent to confidence or regret. What began as a belief that the situation could be managed ended with a clear boundary drawn by the court. From this point on, the consequences would unfold on a schedule not set by her, but by the sentence imposed. The case closed without spectacle, leaving behind a lasting reminder of how quickly control disappears when evidence takes its place. The verdict did not arrive with drama. It arrived with certainty. By the time the court reached its conclusion, there were no unresolved questions left in the record. The evidence had been examined, the arguments heard, and the timeline fixed. What remained was the formal acknowledgement of responsibility and the consequences that followed it. The court's decision reflected a balance the justice system often seeks but rarely satisfies everyone. It recognized the seriousness of the offense, the level of impairment, the deliberate choices, and the presence of children who had no control over what happened. At the same time, it accounted for the absence of a prior criminal history and the steps taken after the incident. This was not a verdict shaped by emotion, it was shaped by documentation. The sentence outlined clear restrictions and penalties, designed not only to punish but to prevent repetition. Loss of driving privileges, court-ordered monitoring, time to be served under structured conditions. Each part of the verdict reinforced the same message. Actions taken behind the wheel carry consequences that extend far beyond a single moment. As the ruling was finalized, the courtroom remained restrained. There was no visible triumph, no sense of closure that comes with resolution in fiction. Instead, there was the quiet acknowledgement that this outcome had been set in motion long before the hearing, on the night of the crash, with decisions that could not be undone. For the court, the verdict closed a case file. For her, it marked the beginning of a different reality, one defined not by reputation or potential, but by accountability. The system had done what it was designed to do. It had listened, it had evaluated, and ultimately it had ruled based on evidence, not identity. This verdict did not erase the risk that had been taken, nor did it undo the fear experienced by those affected. It simply established a boundary, one that had been crossed, documented, and addressed. In the end, the case stood as a reminder that belief in control does not equal control itself. When evidence enters the record, it carries its own authority. And once a verdict is spoken, there is no room left for interpretation, only consequences and the reality of living with them. This case was never about status, talent, or reputation. It was about choices made in private and consequences faced in public. It shows how easily confidence can be mistaken for control and how quickly that illusion collapses when evidence enters the record. The system did not respond to who she was, but to what she did, quietly, methodically, without exception. In the end, this case reminds us that accountability does not negotiate, it waits. And when it arrives, no amount of composure can change the outcome.